All right, welcome back. So we're going to start off by talking about some elections in 1866. So Johnson goes on this tour trying to drum up support for different Democratic candidates. And while he's doing this, he's trying to convince northern states that the South was super sorry for everything they'd caused. However, at the same time, race riots are occurring in the South, so it doesn't really seem like the South is very sorry. He's facing a lot of angry and hostile northern audiences who are shouting at him, calling him a traitor. Johnson rages back, calling them traitors. So the radicals really thought that Johnson was trying to give the United States back to the former rebels. They reminded everyone of all that was lost in the war. They blamed the Democrats. And so the Republicans were more successful in this series of elections. The Republicans won more than 2/3 majority in both houses. And this is, a president without a party, so he's a Democrat, mostly Republicans in Congress. So Congress goes ahead with their Reconstruction program. All right, so all pieces of legislation here, keep this in mind. Johnson ends up vetoing, and then Congress ends up overriding his veto. So we have the first Reconstruction Act, March of '67. This put the 10 unreconstructed states under different military commanders. And when they were enrolling voters, officials were told to include African Americans, but exclude former Confederates. And it also stated that delegates to state conventions must write a constitution that includes African American suffrage and disqualifies former Confederates from office. And then the first piece of legislation was that they must ratify the 14th Amendment. When all that was done, then they could send representatives to Congress. And the South was so upset by this that they took no steps to register any voters. And so because they were doing nothing, we have the second Reconstruction Act, same month, where Congress ordered local military to start enforcing Reconstruction, like start forcing the enrollment of voters, start making this happen. And again, Johnson vetoed it, and they repassed it anyway. Johnson, meanwhile, was trying to limit the power of these military commanders that were in charge of those states. So there were 10 states, there were 5 commanders, so each commander had, 2 states that were in their district. Johnson was trying to remove them from office, trying to pass legislation or implement policies that limited their power and the scope of what they could do. So this leads us to the third Reconstruction Act in July, which stated that military commanders were given supreme power in overseeing Reconstruction. And that was to undo everything Johnson was doing there. Johnson vetoed it, Congress overrode his veto. Now, after the third Reconstruction Act, we have the first Alabama state elections. And the elections stated that majority of eligible voters were required for passing these things. And the white people in Alabama boycotted these elections to the extreme of preventing a majority of voters from even participating. So that takes us to the fourth Reconstruction Act in March of '68, which stated only a majority of participating voters was needed to ratify the state constitution. And so instead of being a majority of eligible voters, it was a majority of participating voters. So if you show up to vote, anyone who shows up, the majority there is the one. So encouraging more people to come out and vote. By June of '68, after that went through, 7 states were readmitted to the Union. In '69, we have slower states trickling in for readmission: Texas, Virginia, Mississippi. And then the final state in 1870 to rejoin the Union was Georgia. All right. So let's talk about impeachment. So throughout 1867, the time we just talked about, all those Reconstruction Acts, Johnson was constantly being overridden by Congress and constantly trying to find other ways to assert himself, removing commanders who enforced these new laws. So then Congress would have to go and, create new legislation. Congress, responded each time by restricting his power to issue orders. And Congress passed in March of '67 this Tenure of Office Act. which forbade Johnson from removing cabinet members. And they passed this because there was one last radical Republican remaining in his cabinet, which was the Secretary of War, Stanton. And so they passed this Tenure of Office Act. Johnson is no longer allowed to remove cabinet members. However, in February of '68, Johnson tries to remove Stanton anyway. And because he was doing something that was officially illegal, the House of Representatives approved articles of impeachment against him. So he had violated the Tenure of Office Act. And on top of that, they added in that he was constantly obstructing Reconstruction legislation. Johnson's lawyers argued that the president can only be impeached for indictable crimes. Radicals argued that impeachment applies to political offenses, not just crimes. So there's a bit of a debate there, and it was a very close vote. So in May of '68, the Senate voted, and they voted 35-19 to convict him, which was one vote short of the 2/3 needed to remove the president from office. So he did remain. All right, so freedom. What does it look like in the South now for people who are newly freed from slavery? So the very extreme forms of oppression were pretty much gone. So the constant beatings, the constant murder, the constant rape, they still existed to some degree, but it wasn't, a daily fear for every single person. They did technically have freedom of movement, so they could go where they wanted. However, if they were seen as a vagrant, they could be arrested for vagrancy and put back into what was essentially slavery. They technically did perform labor for benefit, for wages, or for being able to live somewhere, which we'll get into in a moment. They could technically change jobs if they wanted to. And they did have a full legal name under the eyes of the U.S. government. And that was a new thing for them. Family life. So as I mentioned before, their marriages had been made legal, but many of them chose to remarry, even though it wasn't required to have that official ceremony. Men really started embracing being head of the household and kind of using U.S. American patriarchy as a way to protect their family. So now they're the ones that can tell their family what to do. They're the ones in charge of the family. We also have education. So initially, education was provided by churches for about 10% of people's wages. And after 1867, public schools started enrolling African American kids. So about 40% of African American kids started going to public school in the South. Not great, but certainly higher than it had been. And adults started going to night classes. It was very clear after this episode that literacy was extremely important so that people could interpret laws for themselves, interpret religion for themselves. Now, as far as work goes, most African Americans were propertyless, and they still had to work for white people in the South. Whites did want to retain that old system, but with pay. So they still tried to do things like using physical punishment, using gang labor, having this very close oppressive supervision. And that didn't go well. So many African Americans refused to be in that similar system, demanded time off. And because, people did start getting more time off, and because women and children started withdrawing from the workforce, the manpower in the South declined by about 35%. And even though sometimes people would be living and working for the same person they had been working for, because that was really the easiest thing to do, they would usually end up, putting cabins on the outskirts of the property, not desiring or, basically refusing to live in the former slave quarters, which is completely understandable, building new cabins for themselves so they feel like they have a new life. Sharecropping is a situation that starts happening. So African Americans would farm a plot of land that they were given on the white owner's property, and then they would share a portion of what they grew, and that would be, basically the rent they're paying for living on that land. And it seemed like they were working for themselves, but it was highly exploitative. So they were constantly in debt. They had no way of leaving because they weren't getting wages. They were just earning their keep on the land, and they were still, basically tied to the land, and they had nowhere to go. So that ended up being a big problem. All right, so let's talk about abandoning Reconstruction. Ulysses Grant is elected in 1868, and he is a war hero, yet he only won this election by 300,000 votes, which was alarming because about 450,000 African American votes made it to this election. So that means that if African Americans had not been allowed to vote at all in this election, that a Democrat would have won the presidency. And that was really alarming to white Republicans. So they decided they definitely needed to secure African American suffrage. So that takes us to the 15th Amendment, which is 1869, sent for ratification, which says it could not deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And it was ratified in March of 1870, but of course, tons of loopholes here. So sure, states can't deny people the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but there are so many other reasons they discover they can deny people the right to vote. Women's suffrage movement was a little upset because they were hoping to just tack that word sex in there as well. Race, color, previous condition of servitude, or sex. But it was decided that they had to settle race issues first, couldn't tackle both things at once. Grant, we hope that he would have been a great president. However, his presidency was plagued by scandals, corruption, cronyism. He was very, very loyal to his friends, ignored wrongdoing. In 1872, we have the Amnesty Act, which allowed more ex-Confederates to serve in Southern governments. And that same year, Grant wins a second term. The North is starting to become a bit disillusioned. So the last piece of Reconstruction legislation is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And what this did was it prohibited racial discrimination in public accommodations, in juries, places of amusement, transportation, rejected a ban on public school segregation. In 1883, it ended up being struck down by the Supreme Court, except for the part on being able to serve in juries. And, the public's really becoming tired of corruption in the South, these violent elections. They really just stopped caring about the whole thing and stopped caring about fighting for African American rights. We do have a 4-year depression in 1873, which kind of turns everyone's attention to economics and away from social issues. And so Republicans lost 77 seats in that 1874 election. They lost control. It was the first time since 1861. So we start seeing the rise of white supremacists. Largely, these are poor white Southerners who are upset by African American power. So they start killing people, beating people up, both white and black Republicans. The KKK and other groups start becoming like the unofficial arm of the Democrats. And through terrorism, they keep tens of thousands of people from voting. So in 1876, we do have another presidential election. The Democrat is Samuel Tilden, and the Republican is Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, violence in the South prevented about 250,000 Republican votes from being cast. And so because of that, Tilden did win the popular vote. Electoral votes were disputed, so both parties were claiming South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. So to solve this dispute, Congress established this 15-member electoral commission, which ended up voting 8-7 in favor of Hayes. The Democrats were really angry, threatened to filibuster, and so we end up having a compromise of 1877, which stated that the Republicans would agree to withdraw troops and stop opposing Democratic state governments, and the Democrats would let go of the election result and promised to respect African American rights, which you can guess if they respect that promise or not. By 1877, the entire South is in control of Democrats, and they're calling themselves redeemers who are promising to undo Reconstruction. And that is the sad kind of bummer of a note that we leave this class on. Good luck on your final exams. It was a pleasure having you in class. I'll wrap it up. Take care.